It's our pleasure on Between the Lines to welcome and chat with author and public radio commentator Matthew Algeo, who's here at Central Library to discuss his new book, Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure, the true story of a great American road trip. Thank you for joining us. What a great book this is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's set the stage. Literally a road trip that Harry and Bess Truman took in 1953 after his presidency.
Right. It was about 6 months after they left the White House. Harry and Bess decided to take a road trip, a summer vacation, just like any other ordinary American couple. A couple of unique things about this, though. First of all, they had no Secret Service protection at the time, so Harry and Bess traveled by themselves. There were no bodyguards, no attendants, no press corps, just Harry and Bess in their Chrysler driving around the country.
And was that typical up through the Truman presidency for presidents to
exactly.
do that private?
Presidents did not get Secret Service protection until ex-presidents until 1965. So this was how ex-presidents traveled. They usually traveled by themselves. They usually, though, didn't take long cross-country road trips like Harry and Bess took. And not only did they not get Secret Service protection, they also didn't get pensions at the time. So Harry and Bess were rather frugal travelers, and they stayed a night in a motel. They ate most of their meals at roadside diners. Here in Indianapolis, they crashed with friends one night.
So they passed through Indianapolis.
On the way east and then on the way back home to Independence twice, yeah. They stayed at the home of Frank McKinney, who was Harry's head of the Democratic National Committee back in the early 50s. And so they spent the night up on North Meridian, right at 49th and Meridian, I think is where the McKinneys lived at the time. And I actually talked to Claire McKinney, their daughter, who remembers coming home late from a night of dancing to find Harry Truman playing the piano in the living room when she came home late. So it was that kind of trip, yeah.
So they went to the East Coast, spent some time there, and then just came back, correct?
Exactly. They went east. Harry was giving a speech in Philadelphia, so that was kind of the excuse he had to take this road trip. And so they drove to Washington, saw some friends, went up to Philadelphia. Then they went to New York and spent 8 nights in New York visiting their daughter Margaret. Margaret lived in New York at the time. And then they drove back west to Independence. So it was a 19-day trip, 2,500 miles.
And did the trip turn out as they had planned? Did he expect to not be so recognizable as it turned out?
For some reason, he thought he could travel incognito. I mean, it's ridiculous. He was probably the most recognizable face in America at the time. He thought he could travel incognito. Bess, his wife, was a little more realistic about things, and she didn't think the trip was a great idea, but he loved to take trips, and so he eventually talked her into it, but she imposed one condition, that he drive no faster than 55 miles an hour.
That sounds familiar.
And he had a lead foot, so that was a good idea that Bess extracted that. At the time, some states had no speed limits. In Missouri, the speed limit was safe and prudent. So it was quite a concession to drive only 55.
Now, this book not only talks literally about the road trip itself, but it kind of represents how things have changed, how we regard our presidents or how we take care of them, correct?
Right. And what I did, I actually went back and retraced the trip as closely as I could, tried to sleep where they slept and eat where they ate. And I talk a little bit about how things have changed since 1953. It was a very interesting year, really, to take a road trip because it was before the interstate highway system was started. That wasn't until 1956. But by 53, we're getting the big post-war automobiles. The automobile boom is really beginning, and the golden age of the American automobile is beginning. So we have these great, fantastic automobiles, but we still don't have the interstate highways. We're on U.S. highways, and we're driving right through the center of towns. We're not driving around towns like we do on interstate highways. There were no chain motels yet. There are no fast food restaurants as we know them today. So it was a really interesting time to take a road trip.
And it would be a fascinating look at America. This book will probably give people a good look at what America, small town or large town America, was like at that time. You mentioned the frugality of Harry Truman, but in fact, you mentioned he had no pension. He really didn't have much money saved up at all, did he?
He didn't have much choice to be frugal when he left the White House because ex-presidents didn't get pensions, as I said, but he also got no Social Security. He wasn't eligible for that. He had worked for the government, so he hadn't paid into Social Security. He didn't get a congressional pension. He left the year before Congress began receiving pension. So his only income was his Army pension. He had been an officer in the First World War, and so he received a pension of $111.96 a month.
Wow.
That was his only income. It was his Army pension, and by the way, they didn't count his 8 years as commander-in-chief. It seems a little unfair with calculating your Army pension, but that was their only income for a time.
And he had to sell his family farm, I
Right. In
understand.
1958, Truman sold his family's farm in Grandview, Missouri, and he said he basically needed to do that to make ends meet. And that was finally the impetus for Congress to pass a bill granting ex-presidents pensions.
Now, in doing research for this book, you say you traveled most of the route or in selected areas, including Indianapolis.
Yeah, I came to Indianapolis and was very fortunate to meet Claire Clark, who was Claire McKinney, Frank McKinney's daughter. And we actually went back to her old family home where Harry had spent the night those many years ago. Claire hadn't been back in 50 years.
How about that?
And so it was a really neat experience to go back with her and go back to the house and see where Harry had slept and where the party had been that night. And then I couldn't spend the night at that house, but Claire invited me to spend the night with her and her husband at their house. So that's as close as I came to sleeping in Frank
Well,
McKinney's
it's very
house.
interesting. Now, as we mentioned, you're here in Indianapolis to talk about your book here at Central Library. Are there any aspects of the book that we haven't talked about during this interview that you'll
Well,
be speaking about?
there are 2 chapters actually on Indianapolis in the book, from when they stopped going east and when they stopped again going west. And well, I don't want to give away too many good stories because I want people to buy the book, but
Sure.
Harry did get pulled over by the Indiana State Police at some point, so I will give that as my little tease to buy the book.
Okay. Well, the book also is available here at your local library. The book, Harry Truman's Excellent Adventure, The True Story of a Great American Road Trip. And the title itself kind of intones a nice, almost lyrical, comical look at this time period.
It's a pretty lighthearted look at Harry's adventures when he left the White House. But I also hope it looks also at sort of some serious aspects of life in 1953 as well.
Very good. Matthew Algeo, thank you for joining us on Between the Lines.
Oh, thank you.